This is meeting number 63 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I need to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. With regard to interpretation, for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. Clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. Please also note that during the meeting, you're not allowed to take pictures in the room or screenshots on Zoom. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me, and we will suspend in order to ensure that all members get to participate fully. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Friday, November the 25th, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of non-tariff barriers in Canada's existing and potential international trade agreements. We have with us today as an individual Ian Laird, a lawyer by video conference. From the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, Jeff Nankerville, President and Chief Executive Officer by video conference. From the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, Brian Kingston, President and Chief Executive Officer. Welcome, Mr. Kingston. Especially nice to have you in person. And from the National Cattle Feeders Association, Janice Strandberg, President and Chief Executive Officer by video conference. William Lowe, Chair of the Board of Directors, again by video conference. And for Pulse Canada, Mac Ross, Director, Market Access and Trade Policy by video conference. So welcome to all of you. If you want to intervene on a question and you raise your hand, sometimes you have to raise it twice in order to get my attention, but we'll make sure that you get your opportunity. So welcome to everyone. Mr. Laird, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation today. I very much appreciate it. My name is Ian Laird. As the Madam Chair mentioned, I'm a Canadian lawyer, but I'm also a partner at the international law firm of Crowell & Moring LLP in Washington, D.C. I've been practicing international trade and investment law now for over 25 years and been resident in Washington for 17 of those years. It's indeed an honor to be able to speak to the committee this morning, and in particular, it is a pleasure to see you again, Madam Chair, addressing this very important topic to the work of this committee and for Canada. I have to add one disclaimer. I wish to mention that I'm speaking here in my personal capacity and not on behalf of any other person or organization. And in particular, I'm not speaking on behalf of my law firm or any of my clients. The topic is of particular interest. And when I heard the committee was dealing with the review, in particular, of other irritants and concerns with existing trade deals, I felt that I could add to the discussion in light of my personal involvement with these treaties and treaties like them as both a practitioner and as an academic. But I wanted to focus on two elements, in particular, the international investment law and dispute resolution provisions we find in these trade agreements, as well as particularly with respect to investment by Canada's international resource and extractive industry abroad, another area that I've worked very closely with over the time that I've been working on investment and trade issues. Now, it really goes without saying, and I don't really have to tell this committee, that investment and trade go hand in hand. There's certain types of international business, like mining and extractive industries, which by necessity can only occur when resources are located, where the resources are located, and that's abroad and in foreign jurisdictions. It's a fact that many of these jurisdictions have developing legal systems and have challenging environments, legally speaking. And that's where international law and our free trade agreements comes into place. They helped to protect our investors abroad and provide mechanisms for dispute resolution. And we find these types of provisions in our foreign investment promotion and protection agreements, which, as you know, are FIPAs, and our free trade agreements. Why am I focusing on natural resources and mining? Well, the stats, and this is from 2019 from the Global Affairs Office of the Chief Economist, shows that 44% of our foreign direct investment from Canada to Central and South America relates to the extractive industry. In Africa, the figure is over 15%. MAC has stated in its materials that Canadian mining companies operate in more than 100 countries around the world. And according to NRCan, 650 Canadian companies held mining assets abroad valued at $174.4 billion in 2018. That's the most recent year for this data. So let me put this briefly. Canadian miners are some of the best in the world and some of the most active. They represent a large proportion of the international extractive industry abroad. 75% of international mining companies are headquartered in Canada, in particular Toronto and Vancouver, and the financing comes to a great deal from Canada through the Toronto Stock Exchange. So what this means is that Canada and Canadians expend significant amounts of sweat and equity to supply the world with the essential materials to support the modern and future economy, including what is needed for the climate change transition. We have a natural competitive advantage in the world, and we should support it in our trade and investment agreements. So this is where we get to the irritants part. There is a concern, and I think is one worth examining, is that our investment agreements and related FTA provisions have become too defensive and don't support our industry abroad in the way that they could. We've seen recent examples that the protections under these agreements have been diminished and in some cases even eliminated. And if we are going to do what's necessary in the future to support the world economy, this is going in the wrong direction. So the final summary point on that then would that Canada really needs to up its game in the investment area, engage more deeply with trading partners and its and the lead industries abroad in supporting these types of investment, international investment protections. And just to give you a couple of examples, I know my time is coming up very shortly, but Canada is in fact behind in signing these types of treaties, these FIPAs and the free trade agreements. If you look at other countries like the UK or Italy or even China, they have significantly more such agreements. A more stark example we can see in the recent signing of the USMCA. In fact, the protections for foreign investors were withdrawn in that treaty for Canada vis-a-vis the United States. So a Canadian mining investor can no longer seek investor state dispute resolution in the United States as it could under the previous NAFTA. And there are other worrying signs which I think warrant some questioning, and certainly I imagine the minister will address this when she appears, but the pace of negotiation of free trade agreements and foreign investment promotion and protection agreements has decreased dramatically over the last few years. And there are significant gaps in Canada's treaty practice that should be addressed and could be addressed. I'm going to stop at that point. I'm open to further questions and look forward to the discussion with the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Laird. Mr. Nankyvel, please, for up to 5 minutes. There you go.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. Greetings, bonjour tout le monde. Greetings from the head office of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. La Fondation Asie-Pacifique du Canada.
The Asia Pacific Foundation of Asia was founded in 1984 with the mandate of promoting Canada in that region.
To diversify our export markets and our sources of supply for imports, this mandate to promote engagement for Canadians is more relevant than ever. And at APF Canada, we can supply lots of quantitative and qualitative data about the Asia Pacific. And there's rich material available on our website, asiapacific.ca, which I commend to the committee. Today, I'll focus my opening remarks on the impact of NTB's non-tariff barriers, that is, in the Asia-Pacific region, and situate their importance in free trade agreements. And I should preface the rest of my remarks by saying that while I joined the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada as president and CEO in September of 2001, after a 33-year career as a diplomat for Canada, mostly in Asia, at times with responsibility for all of Asia, at other times on postings in China and Hong Kong. I have never done so in the capacity of a trade negotiator, but I think I am in a position to provide an overview on the situation in Asia, and I look forward to engaging with the committee. Now, I know the committee has already heard from numerous witnesses about non-tariff barriers. I'll say NTBs from now on in general. And, a snapshot of the situation in Asia is that Asia-Pacific economies have reported over 14,000 technical barriers to trade. We call those TBTs, and sanitary and phytosanitary, or SPS measures, to the World Trade Organization in the last 23 years. China has the highest number of NTBs in the region, followed by Japan and South Korea. And the number of reported non-tariff barriers in the region has been growing. At the same time, most Asian economies are seeking to reduce trade barriers and harmonize standards, which manifests in a steady rise in trade agreements over the last decade. These include various agreements that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have negotiated with groupings in Asia. We call them ASEAN Plus agreements that culminated in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which consists of ASEAN plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. I know the committee has already heard much about the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, and recent years have also seen various new bilateral FTAs. Canada, for example, as you know, is currently negotiating trade agreements bilaterally with ASEAN, India, and Indonesia. Now, chapters dealing with NTBs in regional free trade agreements have expanded over time, with the CPTPP today regarded as the global benchmark for regulating NTBs. The CPTPP goes further than other regional trade agreements in regulating these barriers. And one study showed that NTB harmonization under CPTPP was found to reduce the prices of goods and increase GDP. NTBs are expected to remain an important feature of trade agreement negotiations in the region and will be important for our allies and partners in the Asia Pacific. While the incorporation of NTBs into FTAs restricts policy space, in other words, countries will find it harder to impose NTBs as they will need to be consistent with their FTA obligations, it can improve access, trade access, by aligning NTBs in these agreements across regulatory policies, making it easier for exporters to create products that can be sold in economies with aligned NTBs due to similarity of standards. This, in fact, is one of the big payoffs of ambitious regional trade agreements. And the 10 economies of ASEAN in Southeast Asia have recognized the need to streamline NTBs and have signed an ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement with a chapter dedicated to NTBs. Australia also studies NTBs closely and has published an NTB action plan in 2018. Now, it's important for Canada to get NTBs in trade agreements right and to help its partners in the region by building their technical capacities to implement and understand NTBs. Canada's FTAs under negotiation with ASEAN, India, and Indonesia include provisions on NTBs, with Canada pushing for an ambitious agenda, while our negotiating partners are looking for policy flexibility on NTBs. Canada should continue to provide technical assistance through initiatives such as the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development to help developing country trade partners to understand Canada's trade clauses and comprehensive FTAs. APF Canada has contributed to technical assistance training for ASEAN trade officials to understand and learn from the Canadian approach to the participation of micro, small, and medium enterprises, MSMEs, in trade. And we've provided technical information, for example, on the Canadian approach to FTAs to ASEAN policymakers in areas such as rules of origin, customs and trade facilitation, TBT and SPS measures. In conclusion, NTBs are prevalent in Asia. They can have a distorting impact on trade. That said, there are NTBs that protect public health and the environment, as well as societal goals in areas such as languages, diversity, and inclusion. Canada should continue to negotiate NTB clauses in FTAs to increase the transparent and scientific use of these measures, balancing the legitimate use of NTBs with concerns about their use as a protectionist measures. And we should also support micro, small, and medium enterprises, both in Canada and in Asia, who are interested in exporting, as they often lack the resources to comply with NTBs. And this discourages them from entering new markets for Canadians such as Asia. APF Canada has done detailed work in some of these areas. We're happy to share with the committee. Je vous remercie de cette opportunité.
I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to our discussion.
Mr. Kingston, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. Thank you for the invitation to take part in your study today on non-tariff barriers in Canada's existing and potential trade agreements. It's a pleasure to be here in person this morning. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, CVMA, is the industry association that represents Canada's leading manufacturer of light and heavy-duty motor vehicles. Our membership includes Ford Motor Company of Canada, General Motors of Canada Company, and Stellantis, FCA Canada. In 2022, there were over 1.2 million vehicles produced in Canada, and the industry directly employs approximately 136,000 Canadians, with another 500,000 employed in the aftermarket and services dealership networks. CVMA members are at the forefront of new automotive investment in Canada. Over the past 3 years, Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis have announced over $13.5 billion in investment, which will create 6,000 direct jobs and tens of thousands throughout the auto supply chain. Most of this investment is dedicated to EV assembly and the battery supply chain to serve the North American marketplace. These investments are all part of an unprecedented technological transformation that's taking place in the industry right now to fight climate change. Automaker investments are estimated at $1.2 trillion into electrification through 2030. Due to the highly integrated nature of the North American auto sector, the CVMA and our member companies support policies that align with and enhance North American integration. With over 90% of Canadian production exported to the U.S., the CUSMA is what underpins the success of this industry. The consistency of automotive regulations across the larger North American market has never been more important than today, when our companies are prioritizing investments of billions of dollars required to fund this shift to EVs, batteries, and the associated supply chain. So it's for this reason that our top priorities are ensuring that the CUSMA agreement remains in force and every effort is made to align our automotive regulations with the United States. We recommend the following actions. Number one is to prepare for the CUSMA review. Business investment thrives on certainty, and the CUSMA provides companies with the certainty required to invest in Canada, knowing that they can access the U.S. market. In 2026, parties to the CUSMA must renew the agreement or it will be sunset in 2036, pending an annual review process. A non-renewal would constitute a major non-tariff barrier, as it would remove the certainty required to enable new investment in Canada. So we call on the federal government to launch a Team Canada approach to building support for renewal of this agreement in 2026. This initiative should include governments at all levels, businesses, and Canada's networks of consulates across the United States. Secondly, maintain regulatory alignment with the United States. Canada's seat at the North American automotive table and the hundreds of thousands of jobs the industry provides depends on continued regulatory alignment of vehicle safety and emission standards. The federal government is currently advancing a regulated zero-emission vehicle sales mandate that constitutes a significant non-tariff barrier by micromanaging vehicle sales across Canada. This is a direct challenge to Canada's long-standing integration with the United States through CUSMA and our competitiveness as a zero-emission vehicle manufacturing jurisdiction. I would also note it's a direct challenge to Canada's recently implemented interprovincial trade agreement, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which aims to create a common market across Canada. And lastly, we must ensure reciprocity in all of our trade agreements. This will allow domestic companies to receive, on an equivalent basis, the same opportunities to compete fairly in foreign markets as non-Canadian companies have coming into our domestic market. When non-tariff barriers do arise, dispute settlement mechanisms and free trade agreements are an indispensable tool to address them. So it's critical that these mechanisms be functional in all of our existing trade agreements and future trade agreements that we negotiate. I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kingston. On to Ms. Transberg for up to 5 minutes, please.
Good morning. My name is Janice Tramberg. I'm the president and CEO of the National Cattle Feeders Association, and I'm joined today by Will Lowe, who is the chair of NCFA and a feedlot operator in Kyle, Saskatchewan. NCFA is the national voice for cattle feeders, and it's a critical component of the beef value chain. Feedlots effectively and efficiently produce consistent, high-quality beef in quantities that are required for both domestic and export markets year-round. Canada's beef industry contributes $21.8 billion to the national GDP annually, and it's highly export dependent. Each year, Canada exports about half of the beef that we produce, and the United States counts for about 75% of these exports. Japan, China, Mexico, and Korea are other key markets. I'll turn it to Will.
Canada's recent BSE negligible risk status helps position Canada in export markets as a provider of world-class beef product at a competitive price point. Over the last 10 years, our Canadian live cattle exports have seen tremendous growth from 1.4 billion to 4.5 billion. And not surprisingly, demand from the United States is behind much of that growth. While the industry, this is good news story for our industry, there's concern about Canada's dependence on the American market and our need to diversify our trade. Thus, our concerns on trade barriers fall into two categories: long-standing trade irritants with the United States and persistent non-tariff trade barriers with our free trade agreements around the globe. The cattle industry is a tremendously integrated North American market. Significant numbers of live cattle cross the border back and forth every day, and destined to fill either a feedlot in the United States or Canada, or going into a finished market in both countries. In 2021, over 375,000 head of U.S. feeder cattle were brought into Canada from the United States. And that's an increase of 247% since 2017. However, there are multiple requirements at the border that negatively impact commerce as well as the welfare of live cattle. For example, cattle moving across the border in either direction need to be inspected by a certified vet at the country of origin and destination. And once the vet has inspected the cattle, the inspection reports then need to be sent up to CFIA and USDA and can often take a week or more. This appears to be a duplication in the system. If we trust our certified veterinarians who provide an inspection report when the cattle are loaded onto trucks and sealed, then why do these reports need to go up for a further inspection before they can be moved? In addition, the USDA has been reducing the time and location of certified veterinarians at the border crossings, which is causing significant issues with trucks crossing the border. And now we're concerned with potential voluntary country of origin labeling again in the United States. A change in the product of USA labeling requirements or regulations could result in higher costs for consumers at the grocery store. We need to advocate that together we are stronger and more resilient.
And Canada still requires the removal of specified risk material. And even though we've received BSE negligible risk status, the average cost for this disposal is around $167 per metric ton. And this is putting Canada at quite a significant disadvantage to the US. Now, when it comes to global trade of our beef, there are some additional concerning examples where it seems politics is trumping science. So while new freight agreements are exciting, in the reality, they often take months or years before Canadians are actually seeing the benefit. For our sector, this is especially true with CITA, as a non-tariff barrier on cattle carcass washing is leaving us with little to no access for our beef. And now, with the UK accession to the CPTPP, we're extremely concerned that this imparity will continue. So, for example, in 2021, the UK exported beef to Canada at a value of about $16.3 million. And in 2022, the UK exported beef to Canada and it grew to $33.2 million. In contrast, Canada exported beef to the UK at a value of only $7.6 million in 2021 and none in 2022. So free trade agreements must not put the Canadian market at a disadvantage. Another example in which our beef has been locked out of China since 2021 due to an atypical case of BSE. Now, while China has opened trade for other countries, including Brazil, that had the same finding of an atypical BSE case just this year, and trade has already resumed. So we call upon the government to increase its efforts with the U.S. to create a seamless border that reflects an integrated North American commerce for cattle. And we ask that the government deliver urgent resolution to non-tariff trade barriers that are presently impacting the agriculture sector and proactively examine Canada's current free trade agreements to determine how to maximize the potential that lives within these agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now on to committee members. Mr. Seaback for 6 minutes, please.
Great. I want to start.
So hold on.
No.
Pulse Canada.
Mr. Ross. You were sitting
Thank you,
there
Madam
very
Chair.
quietly, so I'm sorry. Go ahead. You have 5.5 minutes now, okay? We'll give you
No
half a
problem at
minute
all.
extra. Thank you.
No problem at all. I'll be brief. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to speak with you today on a very important topic for Canada's growing pulse industry. My name is Mac Ross, and I'm the Director of Market Access and Trade Policy with Pulse Canada. Pulse Canada is the national association representing growers, traders, processors of Canadian pulses, which include dry peas, lentils, beans, chickpeas, and faba beans. On behalf of our members, we're proudly leading the future of healthy, sustainable food through the growth of Canada's pulse industry. And the success of our sector, like many agri-food sectors in Canada, relies heavily on free and open trade with the global market. And our competitiveness in each of these markets is dependent on predictable rules-based trade. Canada is the world's largest exporter of pulses. Roughly 85% of pulses grown in Canada are exported to some 120 markets around the world. At Pulse Canada, we believe pulses can pave the way to a healthier and more sustainable future, providing solutions for every link in the value chain. Achieving this directly relies on our ability to advance trade opportunities and eliminate barriers. When given a chance to compete, our industry is a Canadian success story, and we see tremendous opportunity to grow and diversify Canadian pulse exports in markets like the EU, North America, and the fast-growing Indo-Pacific region. However, the increasing prevalence of market access issues, mainly in the form of non-tariff barriers or NTBs, continues to be the biggest roadblock to our industry's ability to compete and achieve market growth. Our success relies on strong trade agreements that ensure predictable access, putting Canada on a level playing field with our competitors. It also requires a responsive, flexible government with on-the-ground technical expertise to ensure that these free trade agreements are not hampered by the rise of NTBs. Canada has done a good job signing free trade agreements, and we've seen significant tariff reduction for exports in many of our key markets. But this has been met with an increasing level of NTBs in markets of key importance. And while many of these non-tariff barriers can be regulations and technical measures designed to address legitimate health and safety objectives, others we know are deliberately imposed to thwart competition and protect domestic producers. And to complicate matters even further, this is all happening in the context of a weakened WTO and a clear shift away from multilateralism and the rules-based trading system. The nexus of trade and climate, while important, may also present new challenges by ways of NTBs. From a pulse industry perspective, we continue to face longstanding barriers with large pulse importing markets like India. These include unpredictable and technically unjustified SBS requirements and India's unjustified imposition of a quantitative import restriction on peas, which has effectively closed off what was once our largest pea market. And over the past 5 years, we've also seen other markets increasingly introduce NTBs that impede trade. These range from fumigation requirements in Pakistan, unjustified weed seed requirements in Vietnam, to abrupt import bans in markets like Sri Lanka and Nepal. And the common feature among all these issues is that Canada has had no advanced warning. These barriers only became apparent once shipments were denied entry at port or en route at the time of the measure's implementation, leaving both industry and government left reacting. So these issues have occurred in markets where Canada has existing free trade agreements like CPTPP, and in several cases in markets where Canada is currently negotiating an agreement like India. So it really underscores the importance to focus on addressing NTBs for those negotiating and implementing Canada's trade agreements. And we feel that this can be done by ensuring we have strong trade rules and effective dispute settlement mechanisms within these agreements, but also by increasing our capacity in these markets to proactively address NTBs before they arise. We rely on our government partners to address and resolve these barriers. And quite frankly, we've really struggled in successfully addressing these issues before the point in which they're having real commercial impact. So Pulse Canada continues to support strengthening Canada's advocacy capacity within the trade and diplomatic network to address NTBs. And that's why we were very pleased to see the inclusion of a Canadian Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office in the government's Indo-Pacific strategy. This is a great first step and something Canada needs to do more of. In-country resources to tackle NTBs in a strategic, coordinated manner with industry will help maintain and build market access for Canadian agri-food exports. This will be a very important study for our sector, and we really look forward to playing an active role as it takes shape, and we thank all members in advance for taking this important work seriously. So thank you, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ross. Now on to Mr. Seaback for 6 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Kingston, I just wanted to start with you. I put something that you had said to Mr. Volpe at one of our committee hearings with respect to sort of decoupling of regulations with respect to autos in the United States. Mr. Volpe said, well, it may be attractive to create a bit of an island so that you can provide a narrative in Canada, a leadership narrative, as noble as it is. It does put Canadian manufacturing at a disadvantage because what will happen, which we've seen specifically, is that companies will either have to create a subnational jurisdiction only product or they'll pull the product. And you sort of mentioned that, how we seem to be decoupling with the United States on zero-emission vehicle targets. How significant a problem is that if we do that? And how much of Canadian autos are exported to the United States? And therefore, how much would that be in effect if this decoupling continues?
Thank you. It's a significant problem. Over 90% of what we produce in this country goes to the United States. That is the market, and that's the reason manufacturers locate here, is to access that market. What we're seeing is a very concerning trend of decoupling, particularly on the ZEV file. The reason this industry has succeeded in Canada is because since the Auto Pact, there's been recognition by government that we must align our regulations, both for things like vehicle safety, emission standards, and also our trade policies with the United States to be part of that integrated market. That was reinforced in the NAFTA agreement and most recently reinforced in the CUSMA, the USMCA. And we have always aligned our regulations across the board, but specifically on emissions. And we just recently saw the Biden administration come forward with very stringent vehicle emissions targets. And Canada, instead of taking the approach of aligning with the U.S., is now pursuing its own zero-emission vehicle sales mandate, which is a totally new regulation. And it's frankly redundant and unnecessary in the context of what the Biden administration is doing. So it's very concerning, and it's very problematic for industry.
Thanks very much. I wanted to speak with Mr. Sorry, I apologize. Just 1 second here. I'm going off my notes. Mr. Laird, you've been talking about a little bit about NTBs. And so my question, I guess, is this. We heard from the Asia Pacific Foundation about 14,000 NTBs are now coming up, mostly from China, Japan, South Korea. We also know that issues with respect to sanitary and phytosanitary measures and NTBs are coming up increasingly at the WTO. What I keep hearing, though, is that things are not getting resolved at the WTO in any kind of a rapid manner, if at all. So I wonder if you could comment on how important it is to have extraordinarily robust mechanisms within FTAs to deal with NTBs. And I know that was a lot of acronyms.
Well, I think you raised a really important point about dispute resolution indirectly, which is one of the areas that I specialize in. The WTO has been experiencing for the last many years a real difficulties in dealing with its dispute resolution mechanism, which is really marginalizing it in many ways, which is increasingly unfortunate. What that does is that forces countries to take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and address those types of issues in free trade agreements. And I think our trade associations have been very mindful of that. And the focus has been in developing free trade agreements like the ASEAN agreement, which is obviously an absolutely critical region for Canadian trade and investment. So from my perspective, what I want to speak about today on investment, although not called a non-tariff barrier, it is a impediment to Canadian activities in regions like ASEAN if the kind of international protections, not only trade protections, but investment protections are provided for investors. Because part of that is because international trade isn't just about sending stuff abroad. Our companies work abroad. They have operations abroad to have that kind of complete business model. Many of them operate, a large percentage of their business abroad. So the types of protections you can see in investment agreements and investment provisions of these types of treaties are absolutely critical, again, to provide that environment which, whether you call them non-tariff barriers or not, it really, you have to have the top quality provisions.
Looking at, and Canada has a host of new agreements that they're looking to negotiate, FTAs. Where would you put the dispute mechanisms dealing with non-tariff barriers on the scale of importance in negotiating those agreements? The absolute top, very near the top. That's my question.
Yeah, and those types of non-tariff barriers end up being the types of irritants that lead to these types of disputes. So I think it has to, absolutely, these treaties need dispute resolution provisions. To not have these types of provisions incredibly hampers our traders and investors, because there's no impact for breaches of these treaties. So I put a very high priority on having those types of provisions.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mr. Varani for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to all of the witnesses here and online for joining us here for this very important study. Just a comment before I start my questions. I think one of the witnesses had said earlier that we've had sort of a slowdown in the negotiation of FTAs. I would respectfully sort of beg to differ. In the last 7 years, Canada has actually concluded agreements on CETA, CPTPP, and CUSMA, and we remain the only member of the G7 that has a free trading relationship with every other member of the G7. And as one of the later witnesses pointed out, we're actively pursuing agreements with ASEAN, India, and Indonesia, as well as the UK. But I want to turn my first question to the folks from Pulse Canada, and I think that's Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, you pointed out the sort of prevalence, unfortunately, of, notwithstanding us being the world's largest pulse exporter to over 100 countries around the planet, that sanitary and phytosanitary standards continue to rear their ugly head, sometimes in less than ideal or less than good faith ways. You touched on this fact, and you know that the Indo-Pacific strategy that we launched last fall includes an agricultural office sort of in situ, like on site in the region, and it's funded to the tune of about almost $32 million. Can you just tell the committee what that kind of office represents in terms of an opportunity to be there on the ground, to ideally ideally ward off issues before they arise, but secondly, to deal with issues once they come up. How does that affect your work?
Yeah, so that was something that Pulse Canada, along with a number of our other counterparts at Ag commodity associations in Canada, supported very much. And like I mentioned, it's very important that in addition to having these mechanisms within trade agreements, that we have a sustained and long-term presence and relationship building initiative by both industry and government in the regions that we trade with. So, we know that while some of the barriers we face are put in place deliberately for protectionist reasons, many of these barriers are also often due to the importing country's lack of resources, time, or expertise to implement a proper risk assessment system for incoming commodities. So we know that specifically in the Indo-Pacific, many of these economies could benefit from regulatory and technical capacity building work. So we hope to see a major focus on that through this office, and we're very happy to see this as a first step towards that.
Thank you. Mr. Ross, you'll know that Minister Goyal from India, the Minister of Commerce, who's Mary Ng's analog, is actually in Ottawa these next couple of days, and there's some events and discussions that are happening in relationship to the early progress agreement that's being pursued. So you can rest assured I've heard you on the peas issue that will be raised, but in terms of the opportunism of working towards that agreement with India, are there specific issues or matters that you would like us to be raising with Minister Goyal, given this momentous opportunity of having him here on the ground in Ottawa as we speak? So, Mr. Ross?
For sure. Yeah. So we very much support the government's efforts to conclude an early progress trade agreement with India. An EPTA that creates predictable and transparent policy in general for the trade in pulses between Canada, the world's largest pulse exporting country, and India, the world's largest pulse consumer, would really be a major win for Canadian farm businesses and the entire pulse value chain in Canada. But we've also found that through our continued engagement with India stakeholders is that an EPTA, including strong provisions regarding the trade in pulses, would also be a win for India in ensuring the availability of pulses in an environment of increasing consumption. So the minister will know that the projected demand for pulses in India is expected to rise to around 39 million tons by 2050 from the current demand of around 23 million tons. So this presents an important opportunity for the Canadian pulse sector, which has been India's largest and most reliable pulse supplier. So it's really about how can we support their food security needs moving forward, and what type of framework, predictable and transparent framework can we put in place to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. I want to turn my focus to Mr. Nankavel with respect to what you were talking about the Asia Pacific Foundation. And I found you very much in the weeds in terms of details, but I actually thoroughly enjoyed it. So in November of last year, the Prime Minister was actually on the ground at ASEAN, and there was a public announcement about the agreement between ASEAN and Canada to change Canada's status and move towards elevating Canada's status to that of a strategic partner. You know, and you've noted that in your comments, that we are working towards a trade deal, a free trade deal with ASEAN. But can you tell us about what that kind of announcement last November means in terms of elevating Canada to a strategic partner status? How does that help the process of getting an FTA concluded? Over to you, Mr. Nankavel.
Thanks. Well, in short, I would say it's of political significance in the signal it sends to the 10 country members of ASEAN about the importance of the Canada relationship, as well as to the Secretariat of ASEAN, and I think it will give it is giving momentum to the and energy to the trade agreement negotiations with ASEAN. That said, you know, the biggest challenge about negotiating a trade agreement with a 10 country grouping is the different levels of development among the countries. You have members of ASEAN, including Cambodia and Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, at lower levels of development, and you have countries like Singapore and Malaysia at the high end. So I wouldn't underestimate the challenges in getting across the finish line on that, but there's definitely a new energy, and the announcements that came out of the Indo-Pacific strategy rollout by the government have been noted by our interlocutors, our counterparts in Southeast Asia, by leaders in those governments. And I can tell you, having been in the region a few times since November, there's keen anticipation about a sustained, stepped-up Canadian engagement in the region, and leaders in those countries are looking forward to seeing the signs of that, the beefing up of diplomatic missions. It's already been mentioned, the establishment of a strengthened regional hub for agriculture and agri-food Canada, including CFIA personnel in the region. All of those things, as we start to see more Canadians on the ground in the region, that will help to build the kind of relationships that you need to get these agreements across the line.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Savard Tremblay for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to all the witnesses for your presentations today. First, I would like to come back to my colleague Véronique's questions asked of Mr. Ross. This diversification office of markets in Asia Pacific, you had commented on this when we did a study last June. We're talking about the Indo-Pacific region, but the model of that office could work elsewhere. I wonder if it's a model that can be imported easily, or is it very particular to the Indo-Pacific region? You talked about requirements in Pakistan, or also grain in Vietnam. And first question in this regard. I'm quite surprised that the diplomatic corps is not in a position to monitor this closely and to be able to keep you informed. Why do you need that office in addition to consular services and embassies?
Thank you for the question. I think I'd start off by saying that, we do rely on our Trade Commission service, and they do a very commendable and great job in a lot of our key markets. But oftentimes they have many issues to deal with, many priorities, and don't have the ability to focus directly on the agri-food trade issues that we experience and are experiencing increasingly so in markets around the world, specifically when it comes to SPS-related issues. We know competitors like the U.S. have a much more extensive network of diplomats and foreign officials working on these matters for them. So for us, it was really about how can we be efficient in a region that's very important for the ag sector broadly in the Indo-Pacific, and have dedicated resources to address these issues. And to your point about this model working elsewhere, I think that's a great point. I think that's something that we would like to see in other markets of key importance, having more of a sustained and long-term presence in the region, and a specific focus on regulatory and technical capacity building as we see more and more of these non-tariff trade barriers in the area of SPS-related issues.
Mais vous avez parlé beaucoup donc.
You talked a great deal about that office as a source of information, being made aware of something before shipments arrive or be returned to sender, as we say. But aside from information, what is the actual purpose? What kind of actions are tied in with these new policies being implemented?
I would say if you're referring to the technical capacity building efforts that I noted, I think these can take place through a number of ways, whether it's visits to production sites, labs, research stations, engaging with eminent academics and their institutions, market studies, et cetera. But all programs embedded in trade facilitation and development assistance, I think we would see as very advantageous for addressing these barriers.
Merci, Monsieur Ross.
Thank you very much, Ross. Now, for Mr. Laird, these provisions for the dispute settlement, they are enshrined in the CPTPP. And I'm wondering, does that not open the possibility for foreign investors to undermine public policy? The UK, in its report, is very concerned about this and mentioned that this could undermine public policy such increasing minimum wage or progressively, undermine the use of domestic oil. So even if this could do away with illegitimate NTBs, it could censor political decision making. What kind of a mechanism would you advocate to reach a compromise between a healthy public policy yet a respect to legislate?
Thank the member for the question. That's a very key question, and it goes to the balance of these types of investment protections, balancing the protection of the investor in the foreign state with the right to regulate, as you say, which is absolutely key. I think you can look at agreement like CPTPP and see that there's been great efforts actually to try to address that balance. And from an academic and practitioner point of view, the state's position is certainly well represented to make sure that right to regulate is considered. And as an individual who's been in counsel in these types of cases, international arbitrations and arbitrator, I believe that there is a balance, and that tribunals are certainly taking well into consideration the government issues. So in terms of the types of provisions, it really goes to the types of substantive standards which I think you can see have been well taken care of that issue of right to regulate.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Cannings for up to 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. And I think I'll continue with Mr. Laird on that topic. It seems that there's a trend recently with some of the free trade agreements around the world for these investor-state dispute mechanisms to be pulled out of agreements, especially where you have countries that seem to have a mature and robust judicial system where investors can use the courts. For instance, although the investor-state dispute mechanism is enshrined in CPTPP, I've heard recently that Australia and the UK have signed a side letter agreement to remove it, or in a bilateral way when the UK accesses to that agreement. It's come out of COSMA. And I'm just wondering whether you can comment on that trend, because as Monsieur Savard-Tremblay mentioned, there is this opposite effect where it really does hamper local governments, provincial governments, federal governments here in terms of what they can do in terms of new legislation around labor practices, around environmental issues, et cetera.
Well, I thank the member for that question. And I think just following on your last point, the idea that there may be some regulatory chill, I think just from an academic point of view, that has been well studied, and there certainly is not a definitive conclusion that is the case. If you actually look at the specific case law, and in terms of just pure winners and losers, certainly investors have not had particular success under these treaties. In fact, they received, when they are successful, fractions of what they claim, and governments routinely win these cases. So from just from the stats, it's hard to say that this is something that's been undermining government right to regulate. That being said, and this is WTO, all of international law, it is like all law. It puts limits on government, and it addresses very fundamental rights, like not to be discriminated against, to be treated fairly and equitably, and to be compensated for expropriation. And these are very basic standards that have developed in international economic law for the last 100 years. So it shouldn't be something that the Canadian government or governments should be afraid of.
And just, you were using mining, or you were concentrating on mining in your remarks, and I just coincidentally had a meeting with the CEO of Tech Resources in my office last week, here in Ottawa for another reason, as you can imagine. But we were talking about their operations in Chile, for instance. I was just down in Chile recently on a parliamentary visit, and he brought up the fact that Tech has chosen to act in Chile the way it acts in Canada. And I don't think that is the case for many Canadian mining companies. And they have managed to sign impact benefit agreements with communities, develop very large projects with absolutely no controversy at all. And yet, it seems the trouble Canada has, the bad reputation in many cases it has, is when it does not do that, when companies kind of take advantage of countries without the capacity to regulate.
No, and you're addressing a very key issue of these types of protections, is they protect the investors, but it also gives a chance for respondent states to bring up these types of issues. So in fact, these types of cases show both sides of what's going on, and that kind of transparency and bringing out those types of issues is very important, because we should hold certainly Canadian miners and extractive industry folks abroad to Canadian standards. And that's what these treaties seek to do as well.
And how much time do we have, Madam Chair?
2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, wow. Well, I'll continue down that road, because this is a particular interest to me in terms of, dealing with Canada's operations in other countries. And as you mentioned, we have an oversized influence in the mining sector because most of the mining companies are based in Canada. And so that's where we see some of our impact abroad. And we have a commissioner on responsible enterprise in Canada that who was before this committee earlier and said that she was essentially getting no complaints from Latin America, for instance, or Africa, because the community groups that had issues with Canadian mining companies felt that that office had no power. It has no power to call witnesses, call testimony from witnesses, to call documents. And so those groups were going to the United Nations and taking other routes. And again, this is a side issue, perhaps it's peripheral to the issue of non-tariff barriers, but I think it plays into why some of these countries may take actions against Canadian investors. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on the commissioner, on that office. If we had it strengthened, then we would have fewer disputes abroad.
Yeah, no, that the commissioner issue is certainly one that's very important. I would put it a little outside my topic of discussion, but it does go to the overall, I think, point that when Canadian companies are involved in these foreign jurisdictions and investing substantial amounts of money, if there are going to be disputes, they should be balanced. And I believe that the Canadian treaties that address these issues make great strides in seeking to achieve that balance.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Martel for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses in attendance today. For Mr. Laird, you mentioned, and it's a concern to me, that in our free trade agreements, Canada has to redouble its efforts because we're lagging behind. I would like to know, this lagging behind, can it be caught up, or is that something we'll never be able to catch up on?
Well, thanks to the member for asking that question. It was addressed indirectly earlier. I have to give credit where credit is due. The efforts with regard to CP, TPP, and ASEAN certainly have been significant. When we look at the USMCA or CUSMA, as we call it in Canada, that was really about assuring continued rights. And in fact, I see that again as retrograde, that our largest source of international investment has been, eliminated from a dispute resolution point of view. But in terms of those other areas, if we look to the investment in, say, South America and Africa, there are still significant jurisdictions that have not been covered by free trade agreements or FIPAs. And I think that was more my commentary, that there's still significant work on that front. And there are numerous agreements that have been negotiated but not signed, and numerous states that in which negotiations have started but not completed. And that's just on the record if you go to the Global Affairs website. And there is clearly a lot more work to do.
Monsieur, encore une.
Once again, for you, Mr. Laird, I would like to talk about the agreement on softwood lumber since 2006. It seems that we haven't seen the light at the end of the tunnel. There have been many WTO disputes. We are well aware of that. And Minister Ng had announced that she will challenge the rights being imposed by the United States under Chapter 10. Now, I would like to know what's happening with all of these WTO dispute settlements, processes. Why are we not able to reach any agreements after all these years?
Well, the WTO situation really goes to the difficulty in appointing new members to the dispute resolution bodies. And so it's just become, virtually impossible to bring disputes through the WTO mechanism, which is certainly a real shame, because in years past it was a very useful venue for these disputes. I think in terms of the options of Minister Ng, the USMCA still has a state-to-state dispute resolution mechanism, and that's certainly open to Canada. And I suspect that's what she was talking about. And that's still a pretty robust mechanism. And if Canada sought to use it, I think that's would be the route to go.
Oui, ma prochaine question.
My next question is for Mr. Kingston. Mr. Kingston, in the trade agreements, there's a lot of talk about reciprocity of standards, but we note that that is not always equitable in all sectors. I would like to ask your opinion. In what sectors should we revisit some of these things that disadvantage Canada?
Martel, an excellent question. Reciprocity, particularly in manufacturing and automotive, is really important. As I noted, most of our manufacturing and production goes to the United States. But that said, we do have opportunities to export to other markets. And if you look at both Japan and Korea, there are long-standing non-tariff barriers that have been in place that weren't fully addressed in our trade agreements, which provide serious barriers to manufacturers that look to export from North America into those markets. And many examples, certification requirements, spectrum allocation, all sorts of tools to stifle imports from other markets. So it's really important that our trade deals have reciprocity built in. And if it's not achieved, then we need dispute settlement mechanisms to take on those barriers.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Aria, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I would like to ask a question to Mr. Laird. Mr. Laird, I'm glad that you brought up the contributions of the significance of mining companies in Canada. Many of us tend to forget the enormous contribution that mining companies have made and continue to make in Canadian economy and the prosperity that we enjoy today. Mining companies have got a significant role in that. You rightly highlighted the non-tariff barriers coming up in different places. For example, in Tanzania, they have implemented the export ban of copper, gold and copper concentrates. In Democratic Republic of Congo, I believe the second largest cobalt mine has been shut down due to the demand of the government that there be local processing. The same in Tanzania, which has stopped the export of copper concentrates, again insisting on domestic processing. Indonesia is banning the export of raw nickel ore and also imposing some export tax. I think same with Tanzania, which is also insisting on mandatory government inspection and special requirements for exports. These days, other day I was listening to the United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talking about the international economic agenda, as security advisor talking about international economic agenda. Stating that, I could sense the movement from multilateral agreements to economic partnership agreements with selected countries. That seems to be the key. With respect to Africa, we don't have a free trade agreement there with the countries I just mentioned. So that, I believe, will increase the complexities faced by Canadian mining companies. Can you comment on that, please?
I think thank you for that question, Member Arya. I think you've raised a very good point with regard to the need for further negotiation in general in Africa with a number of jurisdictions. In looking at the foreign direct investment, the top 10 recipients of Canadian foreign direct investment, and a good proportion of that relates to mining. If you look at the top 10, 6 of those top 10 don't have a free trade agreement or a FIPA. And I would agree that we should very much be targeting those countries if we're going to provide the kind of international protections and remedies. It's absolutely essential that the minister gives some attention to those negotiations. So I totally agree with what the members said.
Madam Chair, I have a question to Jeff Nankivel. Mr. Nankivel, Prime Minister Trudeau is going to South Korea and Japan in near future. What are the two top things, top issues in non-tariff barriers you'd like the Prime Minister to raise with his counterparts when they visit both South Korea and Japan?
Well, that's a good question, and I think there are others on the panel representing, for instance, the beef industry, the pulses industry, who would have views on that. I think these are very promising markets for Canadian agricultural exports, and there is more work to be done in reducing NTBs in the area of agricultural exports. So that's one area, and I would say the other, and I think the committee has heard about this at some length now, is auto parts and automobiles. And we've identified, the industry in Canada. I know it's expressed frustration about the lack of access in the auto sector to those two countries, and there's a lot of potential to grow the two-way trade in the auto sector in those two countries.
Thank you.
You have 30 seconds remaining.
Okay, just a quick one to Pulses Canada. Mr. Ross, it is possible that I may meet the Indian Commerce and Trade Minister this evening. What is one thing I should ask him regarding pulse exports to India?
Well, I think I've already touched on the issues with their pea import policy that has effectively banned us out of the market. But I think another thing that I'll add is just around the implementation of sanitary and phytosanitary import requirements. While we know it's necessary for protecting human and plant health, it can really increase the cost of agricultural goods and have a significant impact on the price paid by the consumer in India. So how can Canada, I think one of the things that could be raised is how can Canada and India work towards ensuring that SPS measures are science and risk-based and do not impede the trade in food between our countries? Because we do have outstanding SPS issues with India that we'd like to see addressed through the EPTA.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, Maître Laird.
For Mr. Laird, once again, to the question of rights to regulate. We know that we have agreements with, we have discussions with India now to arrive at an agreement. There has been a human rights record that is a concern for a number of areas of the world, based on Amnesty International, for instance. I mean, we know that there is violation of environmental rights, palm oil things, and production that is done in rather deplorable methods. So let's say we were to reach agreements on the origin of problem, the conditions for manufacturing a product. What do we do if we're then accused of imposing non-tariff barriers, and then the rest of the world turns against us and says that we're imposing them as well? How can we arrive at reciprocity?
I think the member, of course, raises a fundamental principle in international agreements, which is there should be reciprocity. That if Canadians have treaties abroad to protect and promote investment, for instance, as I've discussed, then that should be certainly reciprocated. And we should look for that in our treaties. With regard to if the Canadian government is engaged in non-tariff barrier activity, which is limiting that investment or that trade, I would expect the dispute resolution processes would work for those foreign investors in Canada.
You have 30 seconds remaining, sir.
Mais donc, est-ce à dire que...
That means to say that in such a case, we would have to restrict ourselves from legislating in regard to that reciprocity, because we're not on the same footing with India or, say, other ASEAN countries.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, there can be a disparate nature in terms of the basic footings, and you'd hope if it comes to a dispute that tribunals would be sufficiently educated to be able to deal with those disparities and address them fully.
Okay. Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and I will turn to Ms. Tranberg, I believe, at least to the start. And that is, or it was one of the, maybe might have been Mr. Lowe who brought up the issue around, the unfair way that China has been treating Canadian beef exports around BSE. For instance, I took it that Brazil has a similar status than Canada, but China has reinstated them. And I'm just wondering if that's the kind of thing we need. It seems to be kind of intractable, some of these non-tariff barriers. But in this case, we have a situation where perhaps we could have a clause in our agreements, whether they're FIPAs or FTAs, that says there has to be equal or similar ways of treating countries that have similar issues. I'm not sure if that was a clear question, but if perhaps you could just touch on that.
If we could get to a point where we could put a clause like that in, I think, that goes to the issue of reciprocity. But I'm not sure that would work. In this particular case, atypical BSE is a disease that happens to cattle later on in their life, and it's completely natural. This is not the BSE that would shut down the border. And so when you have an atypical BSE case, as long as you can prove that everything is working, we've identified it as we should, then we should be able to move forward quickly. Other countries around the world, when this happened to Canada, took their time, did their quick analysis, and then shortly afterwards opened markets back up for us. And that's indeed what happened to Brazil. They had an atypical case in February. By March already, markets were opened back up. Our atypical case was in 2021, and we still don't have access to China with beef products. So truly, we've been informed this is more of a political issue, certainly than even a trade barrier, but they're using this, I think, as an excuse to create a trade barrier.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, time is up. Mr. Carey, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Kingston, start with you. Young people that I talk to, one of their dreams is to own a home. It seems to be getting further and further out of reach. Today, I was listening to the radio, and in the U.S., the average cost of a new car is $48,000, $750 per month for a payment. And a lot of this seems to be out of control. People don't know how they're going to afford things. This government, let's look at the ZEV mandate. They set a policy, but they don't consult properly. They expect everybody else to pay for it. And we could talk about the provinces, whether that's the charging infrastructure, the grid, and there seems to be no flexibility. Everybody gets criticized if they don't do it their way. My concern is what Mr. Seebeck started with, this decoupling of these regulations and the costs that it's actually setting at the feet of Canadians. Could you go over, just for committee's knowledge, if I'm an auto investor and I want to sell cars here, how many different regulatory systems do auto manufacturers have to face if they want to invest or sell in Canada? That's the first question. And with all these decoupling of regulations, what does it do to the costs of cars? So, for example, a young person wanting to buy a traditional car versus an electric car. What is it doing to the costs for investors and for individual consumers?
Thank you, Mr. Carey. So to answer your first question in terms of the number of regulations that automakers deal with, it is a highly, highly complicated regulatory environment. It's a miracle that vehicles roll off the line as quickly as they do when you look at a plant, when you consider all of the layers of regulation, not just emission standards, but vehicle safety is absolutely critical, privacy and cyber. The list goes on and on and on, and hence the reason why it's so important to have an aligned and coherent regulatory environment to make sure that production and Canada's competitiveness is maintained. When it comes to the ZEB mandate, it has potential to drive significant costs, not just from a regulatory environment perspective, but also from a Canadian consumer perspective. The current price gap between an electric vehicle and a gas-powered vehicle is about $14,000 Canadian. And that gap will close over time because manufacturers are investing so much, but we have other challenges on the supply side as demand increases. The current estimate is that we need 300 new mines globally for nickel, cobalt, lithium, and graphite between now and 2035 to meet EV assembly targets. 300 mines. I don't see a scenario where those 300 mines are operational in the timelines the government has projected. And so what's the impact? The regulation proposed by Environment Canada says very specifically that low-end income Canadians will disproportionately be affected by this. They will face higher costs of both gas-powered and EV vehicles, and will have the hardest time charging their vehicles because low-income Canadians in a higher proportion live in apartments, multi-unit residential buildings where charging is very difficult to access. So these are real challenges that need to be addressed, and the current approach is not addressing them.
Thank you very much. And in the theme with the government bringing in legislation without really consulting, recently I'd like to talk to Mr. Lowe with the National Cattle Feeders Association. You're probably aware of Bill C-282, and there was criticism that there wasn't enough consultation. I was wondering if you could comment on this bill being a potential trade barrier, and also elaborate a little bit. You mentioned the veterinarian situation between Canada and the U.S. You would think that we'd be able to get that one figured out. Could you let us know of the status of this dispute between Canada, U.S. veterinarians, and what it means for the market here for Canadians and the costs?
I think in regards to veterinarians, a lot of this stuff goes back to some of the issues we had with COVID and border issues at some of our ports. It's become a labor issue on the veterinarian side. I mean, it's no one's surprise. Veterinarians here in Western Canada and across the country are harder and harder we're putting less graduates through college, and we're seeing older veterinarians retire in Canada, and I'm thinking that the situation is similar in the U.S. But we also have, for a time we've had, BSE issues, from 2003 till now. I mean, the negligible risk status change that happened last year, 20 years in the making from our first BSE case. That issue is very slowly rectifying itself. But on 282, we see that as an impediment. I mean, it just throws up another irritant to the U.S. as far as just throwing that, so protecting one industry at the expense of other industries, and we see protecting supply management as one of those things that becomes a trade irritant, especially when we're looking at the potential of another country of origin labeling protectionist non-tariff trade barrier in the United States, and we're asking the United States to not to implement a country of origin labeling. We've gone through this numerous times in the last 20 years, and Canadians have always won those cases. But then we go and introduce Bill 282 that protects one industry over another, and we highlight an issue for the U.S. to say here, we're looking at a country of origin labeling, but you're protecting your industries as well. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lowe. On to Mr. Miao for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. First, I'd like to go to Mr. Kingston. Has your association pursued any initiative or strategy to identify or mitigate any NTBs? And if you could prioritize the removal of NTB in the future trade agreements, how would you do that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Miao. A great question. We do, and we regularly consult with members on any NTBs that they are facing. So again, I mentioned a couple previously, but there have been challenges in particular in the Japanese and Korean markets. Although we do have trade agreements, we do see NTBs when it comes to auto manufacturers from North America accessing that market. Another NTB to highlight is just on the rules of origin front. Canada and Mexico have recently won a case against the United States in the USMCA that has to do with auto rules of origin. So that was a successful Canadian-led approach to address that, but we've yet to see the Americans come into line on that. So it's important that we negotiate reciprocity off the top, but we have to have functional dispute settlement mechanisms with provisions to ensure that companies comply should they lose a case.
Thank you for that. And next, I would like to go online to Mr. Ross. How have recent trade deals signed by Canada impact Canadian pulse exports? And have you seen non-tariff NTB diminish because of deals such as the CPTPP or CITA?
Sure, thanks for the question. I think a couple things on this one. So for one, the market in the world the only market in the world really where pulses are politically sensitive and often subject to protectionism is in India. So that's why this future agreement, not an agreement that we've negotiated already, is going to be extremely important for us to address that. To your question around agreements that have been signed, whether it be CITA or CPTPP, I think CPTPP has been important in reducing duties in some of these markets where we're trying to diversify away from some of our historical markets like China, like India, into new markets. So that has been important. But at the same time, we've still seen NTBs arise. Specific example would be in Vietnam, where their regulation of wheat seeds without any apparent technical justification has hindered our ability to grow our exports into that market. And I'd say with CITA more generally, we do have concerns around some of the stated policy direction from the EU when it comes to things like mirror clauses, their regulation of crop protection products, and how that may, not currently, but in the future, present some real non-tariff barriers for Canadian pulses. But more broadly, those agreements are important for us in our diversification efforts.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to go to Asia Pacific Foundation. Last year, you published a paper titled A Free Trade Agreement for Canada and India. Is the time finally right? Are there any lessons Canada can learn from other deals, such as the ones between Australia and India, and when negotiating our own deals?
So thanks for the question. It's obviously it's a difficult market, and that's why what we're talking about is an early progress trade agreement. I think it's significant, by the way, that this is a kind of a new approach for Canadian trade negotiators to accept less than a full deal, take less than a full loaf when it comes to a trade agreement where we aim for very high standards. I don't have a recommendation on a specific lesson learned from the Australians' experience. I think it's important for us to be watching these things very closely. Australia would be a closer analog to Canada than the UK, which is also in a similar negotiation with India, because of the nature of our economies. But you have to also look, when you're looking at these things, you have to look at what in the other deal, what they got and what they conceded in the language of trade agreements. I mean, these things should always be win-win, but there are concessions and there are things that you feel you get, and we need to really look at what it was that the Australians needed to concede and see if we're comfortable with making similar concessions in the Canadian context, which while we have, as I've mentioned, we have similarities to the Australian economy as a major commodity exporter, we're not exactly the same either.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Baldinelli, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm just going to follow up with two questions to two of our witnesses. Mr. Kingston, first of all, and in your comments to one of my colleagues here, you had mentioned that, the requirement that we would probably need 300 mines, I think you said today, to move forward with that goal of trying to get the 2035 mandate EV all in Canada. But here's the concern. I mean, it takes 10 to 12 years to build a mine in Canada and get regulatory approvals just for that. The IRA down in the United States already has tax credits for production and the vehicles, and they're certain every year they're going to be going up. I think beginning next year on having content, North American content, for 40 to 50 to 60. Right now, we don't qualify. How is it that we're going to be able to compete and qualify? I mean, my colleague has a production facility. I have an engine plant, which is just next door to my riding, which employs 1,000 people right there. So how do we compete in that situation?
Thank you. Very challenging to compete, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act. That's $370 billion dedicated to climate change, with a huge portion of it dedicated to retooling plants, battery production, critical minerals. So it's a big challenge. That said, we do have an advantage in the fact that we have critical minerals. But to your point, we've said it many times, this is a generational opportunity if we seize it. To seize it, we actually have to improve and speed up our regulatory approval process so that these mines get built, processing facilities are put in Canada, and we become a global supplier of choice. Our track record on that front is not fantastic right now, but this is the moment. Companies are making big investment decisions, and if we don't get the environment right, we'll miss the opportunity.
Is it realistic to think that we could meet that 2035 target? I mean, in Ontario itself, the Ontario Electricity System Operator says to get to a net zero carbon grid in Ontario, it's going to cost us $400 billion over 25 years. Is that even achievable? I mean, that's to take us from 42,000 megawatts to 88,000 megawatts. I mean, in 25 years, that's going to be a daunting task. I think they say we need about 6 times the 14,000 workers that exist for infrastructure today to simply get there.
huge investments need to be made in the electricity grid, not just in the grid, but also in generation of clean electricity if we're going to hit this target. And just to give you an example of what Canada's doing compared to another jurisdiction with a similar target, federal government wants about 5 million EVs on the road by 2030. California has the same target, yet the federal government's goal for charging infrastructure is half. 195,000 chargers compared to 400,000. So these are the types of challenges that we have to overcome. We've got a rural population, we've got a third of Canadians that live in multi-unit residential buildings, and we have an aging electricity system that needs to be massively upgraded now.
Thank you, Mr. Kingston. If I could go to Mr. Laird, and in your comments, you mentioned our investment protections, the dispute resolution within free trade agreements are too defensive. They don't support properly, our companies. For example, you had mentioned protection for foreign investment within CUSMA no longer exists where it did under the NAFTA. And how key is it for Canada to get that back into a revised CUSMA? And will things such as passing C-282, which protects supply management, make it more difficult for this to happen because our trading partners could see this as a trade irritant?
Well, if the opportunity did occur to renegotiate CUSMA, I think that would be something certainly the mining industry would be interested in, but probably that's unlikely. We'll be seeing that negotiation in the future. Just to respond very briefly to that point about the idea that we're seeing these types of provisions taken out of treaties around the world, I think Canada ostensibly has a policy under its model FIPA of having these types of provisions. My concern is mainly a caution that this does not become a trend, that the one example of CUSMA doesn't continue on in future negotiations. And we seem to be addressing investment issues in treaties like CP, TPP, and other agreements. So I'm optimistic that we won't take the CUSMA route in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baldinelli. Ms. Dillon, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start with Pulse Canada. Pulse Canada does a lot of work to ensure both a green and a sustainable industry. Can you talk to us about some of these efforts, and have these efforts resulted in increased demand or the removal of non-tariff trade barriers? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And well, I guess just at a high level, thanks to the work of Canadian growers in the entire value chain, our pulse industry is an environmental success story. And, pulses, when grown as part of a agronomically responsible rotation, they lower Canada's environmental footprint. We have a recent study sort of benchmarking that. So, that is part of the discussions we're having with our trading partners to increase demand. And we've seen that yield some results in the EU and here in North America. But also, we're trying to also have these discussions with a market like India that, as you know, right now is hosting the G20 presidency, and their slogan is, one Earth, one future. And so we feel that, we not only do pulses play a role in ensuring that nutritional security in food deficit countries like India, but also in ensuring that food systems are sustainable as well, and feel like it could be a good fit for their sustainability and environmental objectives as well.
That, and I have a follow-up question as well. Have non-tariff trade barriers prevented or held back Pulse Canada's efforts in creating a green and sustainable industry?
I'd say at this point in time, no, but I do think there's definitely potential in the future for the nexus of trade and climate to create more opportunity for non-tariff trade barriers. Specifically, when we look at a market like the EU, for example, mirror clauses, for example, the signals that they want to begin applying EU health and environmental standards to imported product could be troublesome moving forward, and also likely against the spirit of the WTO and its free trade principle of non-discrimination, where countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. So, I think as Canada is involved and in some case leading reform efforts in institutions like the WTO, an effort that the EU is also involved in, we need to ensure that while it's important to address climate change in the new era of trade policy, that the goalposts of this important framework aren't moved in a way that allows countries to unnecessarily restrict trade in the name of environmental stewardship.
A third question for you, but also for the Asia Pacific Foundation and the National Cattle Feeders Association. What do you hope Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy will accomplish in terms of eliminating non-tariff trade barriers? And these are questions for everybody on the panel. Thank you.
So I can just quickly note, and as I've touched on before, I think the inclusion of an Indo-Pacific agriculture and agri-food office in the region is going to be extremely important in creating, as I touched on before, this long-term and sustained presence in the region to proactively address some of these irritants that we face. So I'll let others comment as well.
Yeah, if Madam Chair, let me, if I may follow on that, I think one of the things we haven't talked about yet in terms of how we can address challenges posed by non-tariff barriers is that for every Canadian export, there's an importer. And there are importing interests in all of these countries that whether they're distributors, they're retailers, they're consumers who benefit, or they're businesses who need our products and services as inputs. The way to address, one way to address to get better outcomes for Canada is to build relationships with those interest groups, those stakeholders within these countries with whom we trade. And I think a really important aspect of the Indo-Pacific strategy is going to be the reinforcement of the Canadian presence, diplomatic, trade, commercial presence in the region. And that's going to help, as was just noted, for instance, in the area of agriculture and agri-food. It's going to help to build those relationships with industry groups and others who can be allies in addressing non-tariff barriers where these are actually hurting the interests of people in those countries. So I think that's a really important pathway that the Indo-Pacific strategy promises resources to address.
Thank you. I see Ms. Trenberg has her hand up. If you would like to give a brief answer to that question as well.
Sure, and I'll make it brief. I think it was well said already. The only thing I wanted to add was we have great potential to export beef into our Asian Pacific countries. Japan in particular really likes Canadian beef. So and as we mentioned earlier, with the U.S. being 70% of our exports, we're looking to diversify, and I think having an office in the Asia Pacific is going to make a big difference, helping us to reach those goals of diversifying.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, petite question en fait.
A quick question for the cattle feeding association. We received a note from your cattlemen associations about their disappointment about not getting into the UK and Trans-Pacific Agreement. I expect that you share their disappointment and your concern about the future.
Maybe if it's okay, Will, I'll start and then you can add to this. Yes, we do. I think when the UK separated from Europe, the CITA agreement, they agreed to take the CITA agreement with them. So in essence, because of the way that we wash and disinfect our cattle, which has been accepted around the world, it's a scientifically proven process that is completely safe and has been used and accepted globally. But Europe has not accepted it, and basically that has really shut us out of the market. So, as by the numbers that I cited, there has been, Europe and the UK, has taken advantage of tariff rate quotas and been able to export into Canada. But we are essentially being shut out of being able to access our tariff freight quotas into the UK. And so this was not addressed in this UK CPTT agreement. Sorry, too many acronyms. But with that, maybe Will, if you want to add.
Yeah, I'll just say that we've had trade irritants before with Europe, and previous to this issue is on growth promotants and implants in our cattle. This particular one on carcass wash and using a lactic acid bath, that's pretty standard procedure here in North America and Canada and the US. And it's a procedure that's recognized around the world. The problem with that is plants would have to spend more money on capital equipment to use a different wash system, and they're just weighing off the cost benefit of spending that kind of extra money on a market that we're not sure we're in or out. So
Thank you very much. You have 30 seconds remaining.
Je croyais que vous me faisiez signe que c'était.
I thought you were telling me that my time was up.
If you want to use it.
J'ai plus de questions.
I have no further questions. I would like to thank the witnesses for their answers. It's been very interesting. They are, certainly correct.
Standings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to turn to Mr. Laird again, and we've heard a lot about difficulties with the WTO recently. I know Canada had begun some sort of efforts in terms of modernizing or fixing the WTO. I haven't heard much recently on that. I'm just wondering if you could perhaps take some time outlining what you would like to see, where you would like to see the WTO go that would benefit Canada and the rest of the world.
Well, thanks very much for the question. Ultimately, the real problem is centered in the United States refusing to appoint members to the dispute, the appeals panel, and frankly, whatever efforts we can make to help sway the U.S. to move away from that. If not, and Canada has been leading on this, looking for other mechanisms and means and alternate dispute resolution methods, and that's certainly a way to go at this, and an option for Canada, and credit for making those efforts. But ultimately, I think it's about making the system itself work, and that's a bigger issue, which is going to require a lot more international cooperation.
And quickly, in the time that I have left, and this is a very big question, but what kind of things could you envision in terms of tackling some of these non-tariff barriers, especially around technical regulatory issues? I mean, we've just heard about the BSC situation. How do we get at those really difficult problems?
I mean, this is something for, I think, everyone. That's the big question, right? And I think it's the work of our negotiators, and this actually allows me to raise the point that, I mean, this is an excellent exercise involving the trade associations and individuals. I think when we're involved in these negotiations, actually drawing on the experience of the type of people we have in this room is absolutely critical to identifying those issues. So I would put out the challenge to the negotiators and to the department that they much better need to engage with the Canadian industry when negotiating, so that they're aware of the exact issues that are at stake.
Mr. Seeback.
Well, thank you. I'll stop there. Yeah.
On to Mr. Seeback for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to talk to the Cattle Feeders Association, particularly with respect to the sanitary and phytosanitary issues surrounding carcass wash with both the UK and the EU. Would you consider this to be a non-tariff barrier, because the standard here is internationally accepted? And why hasn't this been resolved? Because there are dispute resolution procedures within CITA. Is it that those dispute resolution mechanisms aren't robust enough, or it's a sort of a lack of political will to get it done?
Again, I can start on this. You're asking the $100 million question because it is not that it is a trade barrier, and it's not that it hasn't been brought up multiple times. And basically, from what we understand, the EU is saying that it doesn't meet their technical standards, and so they're unwilling to move. And we've had meetings with Global Affairs Canada, with Minister Ng's office. I think they understand the issue, and it's been brought up multiple times. But it appears that the EU is just not willing to move on this. And so, certainly at this point in time, we consider it a non-tariff trade barrier.
Going on? How many years has this been now?
I'm not sure, Will, if you know the answer, but certainly more than 6 years.
Yeah, I would say it's in that range, and it's like I said, it's a matter of spending more capital in these plants. Like we have plants here that will do it, and they've kind of done it as a niche market. They've spent the money on that capital, the capital outlay to put those different washes in. I think it's a steam bath more than a lactic acid. I think the data actually supports our current system, our lactic acid washes, as being more effective than the steam bath.
Do you know, is the U.S. Do they export beef and do they use a lactic acid wash, and are they able to import beef into the EU?
As far as I know, yes, that is correct. And sort of to Will's answer, we need to, if we don't have the market to be able to use this alternate system, then why it means the plant has to shut down for a day and implement a completely different system. So we need that market, and right now the market's not consistent because of this barrier. So if we could get past this, we might be able to build that market.
You said yes, meaning yes that the U.S. uses the same carcass wash as you, or yes that the U.S. can export into the EU despite using the same system we do.
I will. Oh, go ahead, Will.
I'm just going to say it depends on the system. Like what has to happen is you have to have two lines through these plants. One for the regular
using the acid wash that you used. Is the U.S. do they use that and can export? I mean, I'm trying to see, is this non-tariff barrier being applied consistently both to Canada and the United States, or is it just being applied to Canada?
I am going to check and make sure that I have the appropriate answer and get back to you, but my understanding is yes, they can use the lactic acid wash that Canada is not allowed, but I will confirm 100%.
Thank you very much. I want to quickly switch gears to the country of origin labeling that's percolating up in the United States. We know that they're saying that these are draft regulations and that they are voluntary, but a significant issue, I think, for Canadian beef. Do you think that the passage of Bill 282, which I take it will not be well received in the United States, do you think that'll make this trade non-tariff barrier more difficult to resolve with the United States, the country of origin labeling?
Well, you're asking a crystal ball question, so I'll give you a crystal ball answer. Obviously they're going to know before coming to the trade table that this is non-negotiable. So it's kind of like we're showing our hand before we even go into trade negotiations. So absolutely, I think that they will use that in their negotiations as well, whether they want that or not, which, I mean, in the U.S. we know that they do, but even other countries as well, if maybe they don't even want access to our supply managed, if they know that that's not on the table, then that's something that they're going to be using when they come to negotiations with Canada.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mr. Varani for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And let me just echo what Mr. Seaback was asking you about to the folks from the the Cattle Feeders Association. So, Ms. Tranberg, if you could definitely drill down and verify for us on that point with respect to the similarities between the carcass treatment between Canada and the United States and the potential dissimilarities on the EU reception. But let me ask you another question with respect to, we heard earlier on at the very outset about irritating non-tariff trade barriers, but also some that might be in the more sort of legitimate or good faith vein. I've heard a lot in my work with Minister Ng about Indonesia's requirements for halal beef. And this is obviously a question that would arise with Pakistan as well. Tell me, how is your industry sort of addressing requirements that are religiously oriented for some of the very large and numerically and economically large potential trading nations in Asia? And how can we assist you in handling those concerns as well, specifically with respect to halal beef? So over to you, Ms. Tranberg.
I'm going to have to get back to you on that as well. I know that the halal beef, now they're starting to look for additional requirements from the CFIA. The CFIA, I think, don't necessarily have the processes in place to inspect and to assure halal. And so that is just a question that we're working on currently right now. So that's why I don't have a definitive answer for you. But I will definitely get back to you on that.
Thank you very much. And can you tell me a little bit about going to the other sort of side of the world? You're talking a lot about Europe with respect to some of the recent questioning, but with respect to Japan and since the advent of the CPTPP, I understand that that's had a positive impact on Canadian exports of beef to that part of the world. Is that correct from your perspective? And do you know what the increase has been in terms of Canadian beef exports getting out to Japan?
Yes, absolutely. There's been a positive result from that. And particularly as we've been shut out of the China market, we're looking to build in other Asian markets. And Japan has certainly been one of those. I don't, again, have the statistics right in front of me on how much it has increased, but I feel like a broken record. I apologize, but we'll definitely get back to you on those numbers.
Okay.
It's not make one.
Yes, go ahead.
Just make one point. The South Korean market's going to be a big one, and that changed with the recent update in our negligible risk status on BSE. South Korea was a big market 20 years ago when our first case of BSE happened, and we've been basically shut out of South Korea since our first case of BSE in 2003, and we've recently established that market, and to be honest, that was probably, as far as Asian markets go, that was probably in the top two behind Japan 20 years ago. So we're quite thankful that we have that market back.
Okay, thank you. And if I could turn to Mr. Laird in the brief time I have remaining. My colleague, Mr. Arya, talked to you about mining, and you guys had a bit of an interaction with respect to the Canadian footprint on the African continent, specifically with respect to mining, and you mentioned this in your opening statement as well. Part of Minister Ng's mandate given to her from Prime Minister Trudeau talks about an effort to kick off a Africa-Canada economic cooperation strategy. Can you tell me, from your perspective with respect to, you'd made some comments with respect to the African continent, how present or not present are non-tariff trade barriers with respect to the African continent? And so is that a pressing issue, or is the issue more broadly speaking your desire to have more FIPAs and more free trade agreements signed with African countries? So if you could touch on that, please.
Yeah, just really quickly, we've seen Africa engaged in its own activity of creating a new free trade agreement, of which the investment is an important part of that, and there's a framework concluded. So it's a ripe time for Canada to re-engage with many of its partners. And as I mentioned, there's a number of agreements in Africa that have been negotiated and not completed, or that have actually not just simply not being ratified, but have gone that direct route. So there's indeed some work to be done. And from a priority point of view, it's certainly a great deal. The future of Canadian international investment will be in Africa. It's a definite growth area, and I would commend a focus on that and agree with the minister's focus.
Thank you to our witnesses. Very valuable information for our study. We appreciate it. Thank you to the committee members. Move adjournment, please. Thank you.